Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to my workshop. Um, I'm going to be talking about the basics of conflict resolution, or it's also known as dispute resolution. I'm going to be using those terms interchangeably. I believe that it is so important to talk about conflict resolution in your chapter because and I'll get into this in a sec, but it is so normal for people to be kind of um, engaged in conflict for one reason or another, but what we don't talk about a lot is how do we actually put in structures to build towards a resolution. So a little bit about me. I am a life member at the Delta Delta chapter at the University of Massachusetts. I graduated there in 2015. Yeah, 2015. I hold a master's degree in public health, also from UMass Amherst, and I currently serve the sorority as a chapter visitation assistant, and I also serve the Northeast District Alumni Association as its president right now. Professionally, I work as a victim advocate in Brattleboro, Vermont. I also live in Brattleboro, Vermont. So what that means is that I work with victims of crime for, unfortunately, every type of crime, from your petty larcenies and retail thefts to first degree and aggravated murder. So when I'm working, I use terms like "that's completely valid," and I want you to know that that's a common phrase for me because I'm likely going to say it through the workshop. And just know that when I say things like "that's valid" or "that's completely valid," I don't intend for that to mean that there's another side, that maybe there's not a valid side, or I may be saying it facetiously. It's just a very common validation term to say that is valid. I have a couple pictures here, and I wanted to point out there's the reason I have Princess Leia as a Funko Pop is because I have a ton of Funko Pops. That is my hobby of choice, is that I collect those. It's quite an expensive hobby, but it's fun. So additionally, just a little bit more about me is I love a good meme, and this is my favorite meme right now. If you've been on a chapter visit with me, we talk about memes to break the ice. So what do workshops look like for me? They're going to be lecture-based. I'm going to talk a lot. I'm going to ask for some participation from the audience. I will not cold call anybody. I'm not interested in putting people on the spot. I leave that to the law school professors. But that said, please feel free to interrupt. Chelsea's going to monitor the chat, and instead of using like the raise hand function or anything like that, just put your question in the chat, and Chelsea will speak up to let me know that there's a question. You can also speak up. You can just unmute your mic and say, "I have a question," and we'll pause and work through. What are we going to talk about today? The purpose of the workshop is to educate members about conflict resolution processes and talk about how those processes can be instituted on the chapter level. Unfortunately, it might be a little dry. I'm hoping by the time we get to the scenarios, it'll be a little bit better. And my outline there is we'll talk through the fundamentals of conflict and conflict resolution. We'll talk about mediation, negotiation, and arbitration. We'll talk briefly about when conflict resolution may not be appropriate. Then we'll get to the well, what ifs, the actual scenarios. But a brief moment about the well, what ifs. Throughout the workshop, we all will be thinking about, well, what if, in all those situations. I think it's best to hold off on scenarios and situations and maybe some things that happen in chapters, and break it down when we get to the end, when we all have that information. If you do have a well, what if, and you don't want to forget it, feel free to put it in the chat and just start with well, what if, so Chelsea knows to hold on to those, or you remember to hold on to those at the end. So question, true or false? Wow, there is a lot of falses.
Lots of false.
If you think it's true, please feel free to say you think it's true. I'll give it another. if this was voting, this would be a unanimous false. And at least my perspective is that's correct. Conflict does not mean disagreement. Harm is a inherent trait of conflict, and that conflict arises from a perceived harm by another person. Harm also is a natural and valid concept in conflict, and if you ever feel like you've been personally harmed, and I'm not talking about physical harm, like emotional harm, never tell yourself that that's not valid, because you come with your own lived experiences and whatnot, and that shapes your perception of what's going on. I will say though, for the workshop though, we're going to be talking about conflict that affects chapter business, conflict that is in chapter business, conflict between chapter members that mar good business. So you don't want to, all that said, you don't want to consider things like, disagreeing on, the location of your social event to be conflict. So what are some examples in your chapter of conflict? And this is not the time to spill tea or vent or anything like that. Please use professional ability when explaining a short example. You can say it out loud or you can put it in the chat. And if you don't want to say, well, my chapter, you can write, well, my friend's chapter. So I'll give a couple seconds for people to think of anything and put it in the chat or say it out loud.
I have a general example.
Yeah.
So my chapter in general is just very big. And so whenever it comes time to create new ideas for either projects or events, we often come into conflict since we're so diverse with different ideas. Everyone has a different angle on how to do it. So we naturally come into conflict.
Okay, that's a good example. It looks like there's someone in the chat that says, between our chapter and our brother chapter seems like a fight for who's better. There's my chapter at times can have disagreements with how a service program occurs with other organizations. And when a person isn't quote unquote pulling their weight for their job, it starts affecting chapter functions. All great examples. I'll take an emotional turn for a second. Breakups are actually a very common form of conflict in chapters because people sometimes choose sides because of their loyalties to certain people. Again, totally valid, but also perfect example of a outside force kind of affecting chapter business. Thank you. Oh, we have one more example. We have a couple more. This is really good. Conflict over helping each other's committees because the chairperson might feel like they're being overstepped. That's a really good example. My chapter tends to have a conflict over apathy and engagement. A lot of our chapter has burnout, but we still have people who have a fire passion ignited and they definitely fight. Definitely really good examples. Why is conflict resolution just so important? I touched on this right before we started, but conflict is, as we know, there's a lot of really good examples of conflict in chapters. It's very common. We're people, we have lived experiences that shape our perceptions, and that causes some people to have disagreements, which turns into real conflict. That said, resolutions or formal resolutions are sometimes hard to come by. I believe that conflict resolutions rooted in friendship and sisterhood and brotherhood, wanting the best for everybody involved. And I always make the infectious disease or just disease in general connection. Think of conflict like COVID-19. When we ignore it, we all get dragged down and it gets much worse and gets out of hand. I will say, though, that conflict resolution is usually used when people are more likely to be successful at coming to a resolution. Keep that in mind when we're talking about everything. So what are the fundamentals of conflict resolution? Getting into the how-to. By the way, I talk with my hands a lot. I live in the state of Vermont. Bernie Sanders is my senator. I talk like him. what you need to know is conflict is healthy. That's just something everybody needs to understand, is that when conflict arises, don't feel like the world is on fire because conflict exists. It's normal. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's just so important to know that, you know, we all have our lived experiences that shapes our perceptions, and sometimes misunderstandings and conflict happen. So while conflict is healthy, though, letting it fester, letting it get out of hand is not healthy. Everybody needs to be as accepting to the concept of conflict is healthy and normal, that conflict resolution is also healthy and normal. If we start accepting that resolution is normal, resolution will be much more attainable. Consent is key in conflict resolution. Everybody involved in conflict resolution needs to consent to the process. They need to know what they're getting themselves into, or it's just not going to work. You should not be saying to people, all right, this person has a problem with you. We're having a meeting and we're going to talk it out. That's not how that's going to work. You have to ask people if they're willing to sit down and talk. And we'll get into what you should do if people are not willing to sit down and talk a little bit later. And you have to be aware of unreasonableness. And that's within yourself as someone that is engaged in conflict resolution with another person, or that's you. We'll get into the neutral third party, but as a neutral third party helping move the process along, you have to make sure that you have your finger on the pulse of, like, is this unreasonable? Is this unattainable? If it is, someone needs to say something. So as a person engaged in conflict resolution, what are the things you need to keep in mind? You need to be able to listen to people, actually hear what they're saying. You have to try to empathize with them. You have to try to understand where they're coming from. You're not going to fully understand because, again, we all have our different lived experiences. You have to be willing to fully engage. You can't just sit back and say, yeah, you're right. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, I'll talk to you later. That's not conflict resolution. It's a conversation in conflict resolution. And that brings me to my third point. You have to take responsibility for your actions. You have to actually understand what you did that may have caused harm for another person. And whether that's purposeful or accidental, you're still causing a reaction with another person. And even then, you still have to stand up for your truth and take care of yourself. You have, while taking responsibility, if you do believe that a true misunderstanding has occurred, you have to voice that. Even if the other person is not ready to hear that, you have to still speak your truth. This is not a one-sided conversation. And just a note about taking care of yourself. When you're engaged in conflict resolution, you can say, I need 5 minutes, or let's break for the day and come back to this on another day, or something like that. It is perfectly okay to set those boundaries, both in the formal process and within yourself. So let's get into exactly what type of processes there are. Mediation. Mediation is a facilitated conversation between two or more people. It's actually really well defined in this picture right here. Those two or more people engaged in conflict are having an honest but respectful conversation with each other. That they're voicing their truths, but they're still being aware of another person's needs. That maybe, while I was harmed, maybe that other person I'm completely misunderstanding what that other person is doing. Those are normal things to keep in mind with mediation. Inside the mediation is a neutral third person facilitating that conversation. I like to call them the BS caller. So when people are starting to talk, of course, not talking over each other because that's not proper conflict resolution. If things start to get out of hand, that neutral third person kind of sets people back on track. They put the train back on the track so it runs correctly. And the neutral third person's asking questions to move conversation along. And during mediation, you want to set a time limit. anything longer than, say, a half an hour or an hour is way too long. You can't expect people to be fully engaged in that type of conversation for longer than 30 to 60 minutes. I would even say that, 20 minutes is a really good time to have a good facilitated conversation. Everybody engaged in mediation needs to come with a, we are going to get work done. We are going to maybe have a tough conversation, but we're still going to get work done mentality. So who is this neutral third person? It's a person that has nothing to gain and nothing to lose while facilitating this mediation. Professionally, they're typically paid, but we're not going to pay people because this is the sorority. A neutral third person, like, I don't want to say position, but that neutral third person is a great leadership experience to have, to say that you've facilitated mediation. They're not closely associated with the parties. And when I say parties, I mean the people engaged in conflict resolution. And if they are close to the parties, that they're not closely associated with the situation that caused the conflict. They're responsible for working towards a resolution, but keep in mind when I say that, they're working towards a resolution, and if it doesn't happen, it's not the third person's fault. It's likely the fault of the people engaged in conflict resolution. They're not really interested in the gossip, the tea, all of that. While, I love good gossip, and you can ask any of my friends. If I'm in that professional, neutral, third party position, I'm not going to be really interested in going, tell me more about that. That doesn't actually move conversation along. And that neutral third person always has to keep making sure that people are telling their truth and making sure that the real stories are coming out. So in our chapter, who would be really good neutral third persons? That's a question I get a lot. I would say, your president, or maybe even an older member in the chapter not associated with the situation, your sponsor, your director of bands, your district counselor. I see a comment here that says vice president of sisterhood. Great example, unless that vice president of sisterhood is engaged in conflict, of course. Your CVA is a great person. You want to kind of keep it to people that understand Tau Beta Sigma. You don't want to bring in some random band member or anything like that. Again, we're talking about conflict in chapter. You want people to understand at least the foundational level of the organization. So keeping those people to Tau Beta Sigma members is the best advice I can give. What's negotiation? I like to call it you give and I give. It's popular in divorces, where you're discussing property and child support and child custody and any other divorcey things. This is not a conversation. So that said, it's not likely to be used in chapter operations. It does sound a bit like mediation, but negotiation is solely on the you give and I give. The third party is like, what can you give up? What can you give up? It's not the best. I would say use it sparingly, because it's not as rooted in sisterhood and friendship and conversation. What's arbitration? Think of it like court, but a little less formal. No turning back, no appeals. Each person presents their argument like, two sides of a court case to a third party, and that third party then chooses one side or comes up with a resolution between both of the arguments. Again, people can consent to this. I know the term of no turning back, no appeals can be a little scary, but people engaging in it are consenting to it and understand that, the outcome that is decided, it will be it. And even if there are hurt feelings, we're going to have to accept that resolution. So how else can we resolve conflict? I just ran down mediation, negotiation, and arbitration, but how else can we resolve conflict? I promise there are informal ways to resolve conflict. And I've kind of actually hit on it a lot. It's one word I've been saying over and over, if anyone wants to guess. Validation, really good, really good. Yep. I'll give it 2 more seconds. Honest conversation. Aaliyah, excellent. And Amanda, validation is definitely part of that conversation. But thank you, Aaliyah. You want to talk it out and have an honest conversation between sisters. It is so important to try to do that before bringing your issues to the president or vice president of sisterhood or anything like that. You want to try to at least have a conversation. Alyssa says consent and agreeing to disagree. Yes, that too. So good to have an understanding that, you know, sometimes you're just going to agree to disagree on certain things. And that even helps rebuild a friendship. I will say there is the quote unquote ignore it option, and that's definitely an option, but you want to use that sparingly and use it with very, very great judgment. It is a proper resolution to conflict sometimes, but if you use it all the time, it's just going to create more problems. Before we get to resolution, though, we have to recognize how conflict exists. And we do that by using our voices. We've all proven our worth as members. We've all proven that we're leaders and that we have the ability to say something is wrong here. And how do we do that in general? I always say reading the room is always a big way to notice it. Especially the president, who typically sits, you know, in a place that's where you can see everybody. Noticing who sits with who at meetings, or are there groups that, you know, bound together during service events or anything like that. Someone should be going up to those people and privately saying what's going on here. And sometimes you have to ask the pointed questions of like, I notice that you're not involving this person. Why? What's going on? We're not here to be friends with everybody, but we have to still treat people with respect and keep people included in everything that's going on. So asking those types of pointed questions is appropriate. So I got through, you know, how to use conflict resolution and all of that. When is conflict resolution maybe not as appropriate? I like to say that when physical harm, sexual harassment, or sexual misconduct, or purposeful discrimination occurs, you shouldn't be immediately thinking about using conflict resolution. You should actually be calling an adult, someone in your university, or someone with a sorority. These 3 things of physical harm, sexual harassment, misconduct, and purposeful discrimination actually could be violations of our risk management policies. We need to know that. It's still important to unpack right now, but making sure that you notify, and I mean, we're all adults, I recognize that, but notifying, you know, a university official or someone on the national leadership team should be involved when these types of things happen in your chapter. But let's unpack it. So when these 3 things happen, you can't reasonably expect someone to sit in a room with their offender and talk about what happened, especially with students facilitating that kind of conversation. This is kind of a different level of harm that needs a lot more structure and a lot more involvement. I also want to say, when conflict resolution isn't as appropriate, when people go through a breakup, you should not be reasonably expecting those people to sit down in a room and talk about the relationship with another third person. That's just inappropriate. However, in the instance of breakups, you can reasonably expect them to act like adults. So if they're marring chapter operations, you can still have a conversation and say, you know, you kind of have to act like adults. And my asterisk there is, as long as these 3 listed things are not happening or caused that relationship to end, you can have that, you know, be adult, please be adults conversation. I like that comment, an adultier adult, yes. So we got to the what if section of the workshop. I have one well, what if, but if anyone wants to jump in with their well, what if, please do. I'll give it a couple seconds. So the one in the chat says, what if talking it out leads to worse conflict? So I'm thinking of this situation where a student is that neutral third person, trying to engage people in a facilitated conversation. You have your mediation, and it kind of leads to a worse outcome. You want to hit the adultier adult button and see if they have any ideas or if they want to step in. But I will give this I will give this example, is that some people want to watch the world burn. As much as I think that conflict resolution processes are good, I'm a realist. Some people want to stir the pot because that's what they like to do. And unfortunately, that's just human nature with some people. And if they cause significant issues with a chapter, you should be looking to the adultier adult for guidance. And sometimes that may mean putting that person or those people on probation or suspension. And I have a question that says, well, what if an agreement is met, but neither party honors it? So that person that's engaged as the neutral third person, I mean, again, you're not responsible for making it happen. It's the actions of the other person, of the other people engaged in conflict. But it's always nice to be, if you're that neutral third person, to say, we came to this agreement and it's not happening. What's going on here? And maybe one person says, well, I'm giving the middle finger to that agreement. And the other person says, well, that other person's giving a middle finger. Or maybe they're both giving the middle finger. It kind of goes back to the some people want to watch the world burn. I think that's just a very realist take on everything. Let's see. Another question I have is, well, what if, as a student mediator, the verbal dialogue gets out of context in the sense of respect? How do you neutralize that? I think when you're that neutral third person, you want to be confident in your, this needs to stop. You have that heavy tone. You have that, I'm stopping this. And if things continue to spin out of control and people are just basically yelling at each other, you can get up and say, I'm done. And you can report back to your president or whoever, or your sponsor, your director of bands, and say, we tried this, it devolved into chaos. I'm handing this off. Does that answer your question? Excellent. And for everybody else, the well, what ifs that I ran through, if I didn't answer your question, please put that in the chat and I can revisit it. A couple other situations is, well, what if one wants to be engaged in conflict resolution, but the other doesn't? Going back to some people want to watch the world burn, and that you kind of have to refer the issue to your sponsor and DOB for further action. Well, what if we don't have a neutral third party in our chapter, or, you know, our sponsor and director of bands are just as involved for some reason? I hope that that's never the case. And if it is, please let our national leadership team know, national council know. Say, for example, you have a basically chapter-wide issue. You can have a chapter-wide mediation with 20 people, with 6 people, with 35 people, however big your chapter is. I think our biggest chapter in the nation is 95 or so. You can have a mediation with 95 people, as long as that neutral third person, likely your sponsor, DOB, district counselor, can manage that large of a issue. We have like 20 more minutes. I have 3 more slides, 2 of which are scenarios. So let's go through scenario 1. A white member in a chapter comments on the hairstyle of a black member each meeting. The black member tells that white member that they don't like the comments, especially because that member doesn't make comments about anyone else's hair. At the next meeting, the white member again comments on that black member's hair in that same, tone, which for this scenario, let's assume it's a cheerful tone. How do we build a response plan to this, now understanding all these types of conflict resolution processes?
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so what if you decide you try instead of having a conversation first, you try explaining to the white member the black member's perspective, like first you talk to them separately and then try to see, and if they still if the white person still doesn't understand, then have the conversation together.
Yes, and you actually I'm not. You hit on what I was going to set as a foundation for other kind of quote unquote twists in this situation. That the president goes to that white member and says, this needs to stop. This person's talked to you already. What's going on here? What are you not understanding? And they have a generally good conversation. That the white member says they understand, but then the black member comes to the president and says, I still want to engage in some sort of conflict resolution process. Now understanding all of that, is there a process we may want to engage with?
Would it be the honest conversation?
Yeah, I think the best situation in this scenario is mediation. Having a person, allowing people to talk their truths, allow the black member to explain why comments about their hair is not appropriate, and especially in the context of no other comments are given to anybody else, and allowing that white member to kind of talk through why they commented on the black member's hair, and then coming to some sort of understanding rooted in what the person that's harmed that black member wants, which is, this needs to stop. Keep your comments to yourself. So what if in this situation, the black member approaches the president and says they don't want to engage in conflict resolution? And this is after the president has that pointed conversation of, this is an issue, it needs to stop. What happens then?
Could you have a conversation with the white person in an adultier adult?
Excellent. Yes, that's exactly what I was going to suggest. I think, kind of hitting the adultier adult button, especially because this scenario does fall under purposeful discrimination. Whether or not it's intended to be purposeful discrimination or not, it still toes that line. You want to bring in the adultier adult to have that more pointed conversation, and that there's going to be some monitoring to make sure that this doesn't happen again. There's a comment that says, as the president, I would keep an eye on it and proceed as necessary. Excellent. It's definitely important for the president to know exactly what's going on in their chapter, especially when these types of situations occur. And if the president was to flag something as concerning, again, bringing it to the adultier adult, which I love that term. I'm going to start using it on the reg now. You want to make sure that is properly reported, that this is a continuing issue and this person is still not getting it. Thanks, everybody, for that. That was really good. So one last scenario. No one enjoys showing up to chapter meetings, and when a planning discussion occurs, people frequently talk over each other, even when people are still raising their hands and waiting to be called on. The president finally stops everything and says, "What's going on here?" And then someone says, well, I hate how person A talks during every... Let me start over. I hate how person A talks during every discussion. Apparently, that person A loves talking and loves throwing out ideas. But that comment sparks a deluge of many comments. Again, having people talk over each other. What kind of plan could we think of here? Looks like Gia raised her hand. If you have a comment, please jump in.
I think first of all, in order to avoid those type of situations in the first place, everyone in the chapter should be knowledgeable of Robert's rules, and that could be resolved in the first place. If that keeps happening, maybe having a class one day out of the week just to go over Robert's rules to get everyone associated with it, because they might have forgotten a couple things. And if it persists after that, then maybe talking to that person, explaining to them to respect everyone who's talking in the room. That shouldn't have to go up to an adult tier adult. Hopefully it'll be extinguished at that point.
Thank you. That's awesome. Samuel, you raised your hand.
Yep. I was going to say that in our chapter, the discussion can definitely get a little bit heated at times, but what helped us a lot is just taking a moment and taking a minute or two and just doing a couple deep breaths. That really helped us. Just sort of everybody relax, take a minute and calm down.
Awesome. We have a comment that says we have a Bob box in which everybody can write their issues and worries on a sticky note, and then as a whole we read them out and talk about it if needed. But sometimes it's nice to just know what other people are thinking and feeling. So what I'm hearing here is that holding it to a conversation, maybe a informal conversation that's not formal conflict resolution, may be appropriate here. And I think that's the best first step. If things are still out of hand after that, I think hitting the adultier adult button and bringing in a person to facilitate a chapter-wide mediation is the best thing to do. Kelsey says that she loves the approach of calling on the expert at hand, which would be the Roberts Rules, and hopefully getting the parliamentarian involved. Yes, agreed. And I just want to point out that I'm a total meeting geek. So when Gia said, we need to bring it back to Robert's Rules, that sang to my heart. So thank you, Gia. Off of me or comments about the presentation or the scenarios, I want to hear from you. We have an extra hour. The room is open until the chapter operations panel, so we can hang out.
It'll be open till about 10 minutes after the hour, so till about 1:10, and then it'll be closed.
Okay, so we don't have an extra hour. We have an extra 10 minutes, which is fine. If not, that's my email and my phone number, my personal cell phone number. Please do not call me at 2:45 in the morning to say that my car insurance plan thing is expired. But please feel free to email me, text me, call me with any sort of scenario, and we can talk through it. I love conflict resolution. I think it's so helpful to have these processes involved in chapter operations. So if you need me to help out in establishing that, more than happy. Any questions? Well, I'm going to leave my contact information up for the next couple minutes, and I'll just hang out. And yeah, if any questions come up, please let me know.
I have a question. As a member of the chapter, if conflict resolution, after taking those necessary steps and talking to an adult or adult, if the situation still isn't, being resolved. I know you talked about having that one person who wants to see the world burn. How do you deal with that person?
So this is under the assumption that you brought the national council or someone from the national leadership team in, and you have documented times about how this person is still kind of dragging the chapter down. Asking that question, which is I believe is the worst question you have to ask from an emotional standpoint, is should this person be put on probation? Should this person be put on suspension? And when I say the worst question to ask, I don't mean you should not explore it. It just means, it causes uncomfortable feelings because they're your sister and all of that. But sometimes it's the necessary thing to do. So that's what I would recommend in those situations. If you start documenting these person's actions and you basically classify them under they want to watch the world burn, we need to do something about it. Sometimes that to do something about it is probation or suspension. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Kelsey, do you want to
Kelsey made a great
explain?
comment. Yeah, I was about to say that. Her comment's great. I think she should explain it. to help us.
Definitely.
Sure. Okay, so for the first scenario, we had a very clear example of racial diversity coming into play there. So clearly there's some cultural aspect to this white member, black member misunderstanding, and we want to assume positive intent, right? We never want to assume that someone's wanting to watch the world burn until they say it. So assuming positive intent, maybe it's an issue or a matter of needing to address racial or just diversity in general to the whole chapter. So maybe we started out with the mediation or the president getting involved and having a conversation with both parties involved, and then it keeps happening, or there's a fundamental understanding that's not being met. And so a way to continue addressing it without putting anyone on the spot, because we never want to assume that someone's prepared or well-equipped. Sorry, my video is probably, yeah. That someone's like prepared or well-equipped to handle a heavy topic. So if you want to call on an adult or CVAs, counselors, national council, like we all have these tools and resources in our back pocket ready to offer that kind of support to your chapters. So if you need someone to call in and kind of, I would say, mediate a workshop. So instead of saying like, oh yes, president, how about you give this like really heavy diversity workshop, like someone who's maybe more trained on the matter, or your schools and universities probably have these already available to you, or someone in the university is probably trained to do certain workshops or certain mediation techniques for you. So I would suggest looking into that. But yeah, I think that's such a great and powerful way to address it without putting anyone on the spot, because that can be really disenfranchising. And we want to make sure that we're not singling anyone out, especially so like the person who's a victim shouldn't have to be the responsible for teaching, and then the person who's victimizing, whether purposefully or not, might not benefit from being singled out. So this is just a good way to get everyone on the same page and know that there is an issue and address the issue without causing any more uncomfortable situations.
I will say that I 100% agree with everything that Kelsey said. But in my experience, I've actually noticed that some people, when these things happen to them, they're like, I want to have a formal conversation with the chapter. I want to present on why this is not okay. And that's a wonderful leadership opportunity for someone that may have been harmed to then turn that harm into some sort of work for the chapter to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Again, as Kelsey said, it should not be an expectation, but opening that opportunity for that in this scenario, that Black member to present to your chapter to have that conversation as well. Excellent, excellent idea, Kelsey. Thank you.
And just to piggyback on what Gia was saying, I put the Robert's Rules workshop up there too. Like, if it's a matter of calling on the expert, saying like, okay, someone's speaking out on every single topic, they should only have 2 opportunities to speak, blah, blah, blah. Like, if we're really getting down into the nitty gritty of formal Robert's Rules and regulation, get the expert involved. So get the parliamentarian to be like, hey, let's review. And the president is entirely within their right to yield the floor and say, okay, yeah, we're going to take the next 10 minutes. So that way the parliamentarian can go over what the expectations are. And then you know that everyone has been given the same information. And I mean, this is why practice meetings are really nice. But then it yeah, those are the only 2 I can think of off the top of my head. But getting the person that you have elected to be the expert involved. And again, like Chris said, just having those leadership opportunities are really important. So if there's like a committee or something that you have, like a sisterhood and a sisterhood committee or something, then maybe they want to lead a workshop on, you know, not like a meditation or like something that might cause a little bit of diffusing of any sort of issues or conflict. Those are really great leadership opportunities.
Yeah. It looks like Gia has her hand up. Gia, do you have anything?
Actually, Harrison had his hand up first.
Oh, okay. Harrison.
Hi. So, I had a question about resolving problems with a brother chapter. So,
Okay.
what's a good way to go about that if they don't want to address the issue at all?
I think so. Not to like have this as my standard answer, but when people don't want to engage in conflict resolution, I think that's the adultier adult button. That maybe bringing in your director of bands or bringing it to your district counselor and explaining the situation so that they, who have a little bit of pull over the other chapter, I mean, the district counselor can then contact the district governor, who then has pull, to kind of say, you know, there's reported issues here, like what's going on? How can we help move past them? But also members could also try to engage their friends in the other organization and say, you know, I keep hearing this. What's your take on this? Or what do you know about this? How can we help each other resolve it? That's the one question, if that's the takeaway of this workshop, is how can we help each other? Is my basis of conflict resolution.
I was just gonna say, like, maybe a good idea for just to eliminate any, you know, further issues could be to have like a workshop on learning interpersonal skills, maybe within the chapter. Being able to learn how to communicate effectively in a business setting, nonverbal and verbally. It could be like really essential when having meetings, just to eliminate any misconceptions or miscommunication and stuff like that.
I definitely agree with you. That's a really, really good idea. Thank you.